And I just want to point out, we're talking about Roman pigeons flying messages across countries right now. I am in the correct here, Mark. I don't want to hear it anymore.
Even though a few allies have gone over to him, most of Rome's supporters stay firm. They don't go over to the Hannibalic camp. And so he has Capua, a city that Spartacus later raised near the Bay of Naples, but not much else. And so he's increasingly isolated in Italy, and they just wait until he no longer has a base from which he can support himself, and he's forced to leave Italy. At the same time, the Romans...
It's crazy that he's just floating around.
Yeah, he's just hanging out in Italy for like 15 years.
Wow. Can you imagine that today?
Yeah.
The Chinese army's just hanging out.
It's just Hannibal. Hey, Hannibal. This whole thing. And of course, the Romans have their own hero now, Scipio Africanus.
I love how the guy says that in Gladiator. And from the four legions, Scipio Africanus.
Kind of like his wig, too.
The wig's great.
Yeah. Well, wig's key. But anyway, Scipio had conquered Carthaginian Spain in the meantime. And then he takes the war to Carthage. He brings an army, it sails, lands in Tunisia, and marches on Carthage itself. They recall Hannibal at long last. And they fight the great conclusive battle at Zama, not too far from Carthage.
Before we get to Zama, I just want to stay with what you just said. So when you say Scipio comes in and conquers Spain, I think the really hard part in me looking at any parts of this ancient history is the fact that we are talking at this point 1,700 years or 1,600 years before there's a printing press, right? Like there's so many things that are still archaic as far as communication goes between people. How do you just walk, look at how fucking big Spain is. How do you just walk into Spain, conquer, I don't know, 100,000 person army in one town and be like, all right, the rest is ours. And everyone around Spain just knows oh yeah, these guys. How does that even work?
That's a good question. And honestly, there's a doubt sometimes in the Roman period, if the empire's been established for many centuries, people don't know who the emperor is. There's a famous story about a guy in Egypt who asks some peasants, who the emperor is. They're like, oh no, Agamemnon, from Greek myth. Even though they have coins of the emperor, they have statues of the emperor, they're just so distant from everything.
It's like the old Howard Stern show when you go say, who's the president right now?
Yeah,
I don't know, Clinton.
Yeah, exactly, right. And
it's been Bush for the last 8, my guy.
And that's just it. Out in the boonies, they don't know.
Yeah.
But the major cities are connected, even before the Roman roads exist. So horsemen, obviously, there are fast boats going between them. There are messenger pigeons.
Messenger pigeons.
Yeah, those exist in the ancient world.
What is this, like the Harry Potter owl? Tie a fucking letter to its leg and it goes?
Like that, pretty much, but somehow less magical and everything. But yeah. So there actually are carrier pigeons. There aren't a ton of them. They aren't used very widely because the messengers are much more reliable, obviously. But they do exist.
And they go where they tell them to go.
Yeah, so you have to train a pigeon like that. You have to they're homing pigeons. They go back to their nest. So you release them, they go back to where they were fed last. And so you don't want to feed them for a long time, or you feed them in their cage. You don't let them get out and nest anywhere. So the moment you release them, they go back to their initial nest in Rome, wherever that might be. And so you try to keep your pigeons on the edge, I guess. So
I need to point this out right now. I went on my buddy Mark Gagnon's podcast recently, and on there I was explaining to him how pigeons are one of the top 10 smartest animals, to which he told me that was bullshit and said it was pigeon propaganda, and he's been giving me shit about it ever since, even though I've shown him sources that show this. And I just want to point out, we're talking about Roman pigeons flying messages across countries right now. I am in the correct here, Mark. I don't want to hear it anymore. That's crazy. So they would incentivize them with food basically, and they'd be able to get Can you imagine a message going from even New York City to DC, landing on Biden's doorstep? Oh, wow.
Well, there was even into the 20th century. There's a famous pigeongram stamp. So I think it was New Zealand. They had some outlying island that was hard to reach in either way, and they had trained pigeons to fly back to New Zealand or wherever it was. And they had special stamps for the letters. They were pigeongram. So this continued until the modern period.
And now we got Instagram.
And now we have Instagram, the OG. or OP, I guess.
So they would maintain some level of control by things like this. You mentioned something about boats too.
Yeah, so boats are the most reliable transportation method in the ancient world. And so if you're trying to connect 2 points and it's summer, there's not a lot of storms that there are in the winter season, boat's the best way to go if it's anywhere around the Mediterranean. So for the Spain, even though it is a huge mountainous place, the coast is not too far from Italy.
Right.
And so you're probably only a 10-day voyage with normal winds from Rome itself and most parts of Spain if you're on the coast. And so that's probably the way they got most of their messages back. And then later on, horses can also go 100 miles in a day easily if you have some kind of decent road.
Right.
Which they usually don't. So the boat's the way to go, or the pigeon.
Right. When did horses first become a thing?
I mean, well before the Romans showed up.
Yeah. It was a long time before, right?
They're definitely, the Greeks have them before then, the peoples of the Near East. They're domesticated, I think, in Central Asia, way before the classical period. And they're pretty widespread in the Mediterranean world before the Romans show up. There were some new animals. So the chicken is a newcomer for the Romans.
Really?
Yeah. The chicken,
when did that happen?
So, I mean, probably like 400 BC in Italy, give or take. They came from the East. They're from Southeast Asia, chickens originally. They were brought to Greece in the classical period as for cockfighting, basically.
Nice.
And eventually they were good to eat too. They kind of got there, and then so the chicken spread pretty rapidly after that across the the Mediterranean world. But they were new. Which is kind of interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
They're like little dinosaurs, those things. If they were bigger, we'd all be fucked.
Oh, absolutely.
Like
they're
they're
terrifying.
Out of their minds.
Yeah. I have a 2-year-old niece who does chicken noise. It's like that, the dinosaur thing, and it's unsettling.
It's so close. They even look like it too, like with the gobbler and all that as well. I mean,
birds are dinosaurs. So
that's what I'm saying.
That's what we're told.
Some of them certainly feel that way. That's why I eat chicken every day. I don't feel bad about it.
You're fighting the good fight.
Yeah, there's enough of them. Like we got to keep them humble. So, but I was getting into this obviously because we were talking about how you maintain control.
Yes.
Of something so far. So when they would get word back to Rome, first of all, maybe in this time period, 200 or 300 BC, like what kind of population size are we looking at in Rome?
In Rome itself. We aren't totally sure. Rome was growing rapidly at the time of the Second Punic War. There was a lot of refugees, of course, from the rest of Italy there. So again, I'm just throwing out a number here. It's not unrealistic. We could be talking 100,000 people in Rome at this point. Not where it would be, it would be 10 times that size under Augustus. A million people.
Yeah.
But it wasn't close to that yet, but quite large by ancient standards.
And back then, 100,000 people, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
So just hypothetical situation here with conquering Spain. They get word back to Rome, maybe by boat, 15 days after it got conquered.
Sure, whatever it might be.
Something like that. They don't have a printing press, so are there just like messengers running around town going, "Hey, we took Spain," and people are just like, "Oh, bet, cool."
Yeah, well, there are a few ways. There are criers. Did you watch HBO's Rome by chance?
I think I saw like an episode at one point. I haven't really watched it. No.
Well, there's this big portly dude who's like who announces the news, and he's the newsreader, and he's a big part of the show. So like Pompey defeated, and he has these very theatrical gestures, which they actually did use in ancient oratory. So there are these guys, criers basically, who would call out the news. There was also a thing called the Acta Diurna, the Acts of the Senate, that was published in the sense that it was written out in certain public places. But of course, literacy is quite low, maybe 10%, probably even lower than that.
Yeah.
So there's no widespread newspapers. So word of mouth probably is most of the dissemination of any information.
But then, from Rome, it's got to get to all the little towns around Rome and all the little towns around them and then all the states around them that are filled with towns just like this and cities just like this. Like, how long... If I conquer someone in Spain in 250 BC, might it be like 3 years before they find out in Jerusalem?
We actually can trace this to some degree. From Egypt, we have these papyri, which are preserved, that preserve mundane things like, the acts of the village council or tax records. And in Egypt, we can know how soon they could tell an emperor was assassinated or a new emperor had come to power, because they date their, whatever they're doing, their acts or the day's edict, by the emperor's reign. And so when they switch over from Emperor A to Emperor B, they know the emperor has been killed. And we actually trace a spread of news from Alexandria, the city on the coast.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time sometimes. It goes up the Nile first, as you'd expect. So they hear about it there pretty quickly. But out in the oases in the desert, it might be months and months after Alexandria knows, only 100 miles away, that they discover the emperor's changed.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here